What do you think of when I ask you to define identity? Seriously, because I've asked leaders that question before, and most people answer almost immediately, like they've had the answer ready for years. They say things like, I'm a builder. I'm the one people depend on. I'm a servant leader. They throw out, I'm driven. I'm the provider. I'm the strong one. And I want to be clear that none of those things are bad things. In fact, most of the leaders who say those things built something real with them. Careers, organizations, families, reputations that took decades to earn. But here's what I've started noticing in those conversations. The answers come fast, almost too fast. Like no one's ever slowed down long enough to ask whether those things are actually identity or whether they're just what got attached to identity over time. And I think that distinction matters more than most of us realize. I think a lot of the tension leaders feel, the tension between what they built and what they're built for, actually starts there. Not in the career, not in the organization, but in the confusion between what shaped us and what actually defines us. That's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm Steve Muscato. This is Craft to Clarity. And this one has been sitting with me for a while. As you heard in the opening, I'm not asking what is identity to be provocative. I'm asking it because I think most of us have never been invited to answer it. We've answered it through our calendars, through our job titles, through the ways people have come to need us and know us over the years. We've answered it by being useful and by surviving seasons that required us to become something, and then staying that thing long after the season ended. And here's what I've come to believe after sitting with leaders, and honestly, after sitting with myself in the same tension. Most of us have never stopped to examine the difference between what shaped us and what actually defines us. Those sound like the same thing, but they're not. I'd like to offer my definition of identity. Not a textbook one, not a framework, just the one that keeps proving itself true in real conversations with real people. Here goes. Identity is the truest version of who we were created to be before survival, performance, and the world started attaching things to us. Before the role, before the title, before the pressure to be the strong one, the dependable one, the one who figures it out when no one else can. Before all of that, something was already there. And I think most of us have spent so many years layering things on top of that something that we've generally lost track of where the layers end and where we actually begin. Think about how this happens. You grow up in a home where being capable earns approval, so you become the capable one. You lead through a crisis and people lean on you, so you become the one people lean on. You find something, a behavior, a ritual, a way of coping that gets you through a hard season, and it works. So you keep it. And slowly, without any single decision being made, it starts to feel like you. You go through a loss, a season that almost took you under, and you find a way through. And the thing that got you through starts to feel less like a survival tool and more like a character trait, more like identity. That's not a character flaw. That's survival. And for a season, sometimes a long season, those adaptations are exactly what's needed. The problem isn't that we adapted. The problem is when the adaptation becomes the whole story. When we stop distinguishing between what helped us survive and who we actually are. If you've listened to Craft to Clarity for any length of time, you know I keep coming back to the distillation process. Not because I'm trying to make everything about whiskey, but because I genuinely believe it's the best parallel I've found for what actually happens to us in leadership, in identity, and in the seasons we move through. And one part of that process I come back to again and again is the cut. When a distillery runs a batch of spirits through the still, the distiller's watching carefully for what comes through the still and when. What comes off first, the heads, it has energy, but it's also volatile, harsh. It's not what you're after. Then somewhere in the middle of the run, the character shifts. What comes through that middle section, the hearts, that's what belongs. That's what the whole process was moving toward. And then the run starts to thin out. The tails come through. They have their use, just not here, not in this pour. The distiller makes the cut. It's one of the most consequential decisions in the entire process. The heads and the tails, the parts that don't make it to the final spirit, they're not worthless. But they were never meant to define the final pour. And this is where I want to go, somewhere on this podcast that I haven't gone before. We talk a lot about what gets removed in distillation. But what actually happens to those things? Well, the spent grain from the distillery goes to farms. It nourishes livestock. It still feeds something. The heads and the tails from one run get added back to the next batch. It's sent through the still again, given another pass, another chance to give up what's useful. And the barrels that held the spirit go on to shape wine, coffee, syrup, rum, still doing meaningful work long after the whiskey moved on. Nothing in the process is wasted. It just shifts purpose. And I think that's one of the most important things I can say about this conversation today, because I don't want anyone to hear what's coming next and think we're talking about throwing away pieces of yourself. We're not. We're talking about things finding their right place and time. Most every conversation here comes back around to talking about distilling the tension between what we've built and what we're built for. And I want to stop and ask you something I don't think I've asked directly here before. Have you ever wondered where that tension actually comes from? Not what it feels like, not what to do with it, but where it actually comes from. It comes from misalignment. Specifically, the misalignment between who we truly are and everything that attaches itself to us along the way. A while back, I read the book Halftime by Bob Buford. And honestly, it became part of the foundation underneath what eventually became Crafted Clarity. Buford wrote it for leaders who had reached a certain level of success, built something real, achieved what they set out to achieve, and found themselves sitting in a question they couldn't quite name. The book had resonated with an enormous amount of people, so much so that leaders formed groups around it, cohorts, communities specifically designed to help people work through what comes next after that kind of success. And when I think about why that book landed the way it did, why people gathered around it, I don't think it's primarily about strategy or career pivots. I think those leaders were feeling something they didn't have language for yet. They had spent the first half of their life becoming someone, accumulating, adapting, building, surviving, succeeding. And somewhere in the middle of all of that becoming, they had lost track of who was underneath it. That hit me. And I don't think those leaders were unique. And then through Crafted Clarity, in just over the past month alone, I've had conversations with leaders from Singapore, Cyprus, Dubai, and Switzerland. Different cultures, different industries, different decades of experience. Same tension underneath. They're not questioning what they do. They're questioning who they've become while doing it. Now, here's something I find genuinely interesting about when this shows up. You almost never see it at 21. It's not that identity doesn't matter then. It certainly does. But because there hasn't been enough time for enough to accumulate and attach yet. Not enough reinforcement. Not enough survival. Not enough seasons where the world needed you to be a specific thing and then kept rewarding you for becoming it. But by halftime, usually after 2 or 3 decades of building and leading and adapting and being needed, the accumulation is heavy enough to create that tension. And here's what makes it especially complicated for those of us who've led at a high level for such a long time. Success makes us harder. Not easier, harder. Because success validates the adaptation. It actually rewards the attachment. Think about it. A coping mechanism that got us through a hard season also helped us lead through it. Now it's part of our reputation. People admire it. Organizations depend on it. Our identity around it gets reinforced daily. People remind us of it. And that makes it harder to examine honestly what actually built it. Because questioning the identity that built the success can feel like questioning the success itself. That's why the hardest identities to question are often the ones that worked. And I think that's where a lot of us get stuck. Not because we lack courage, but because we've been trained as leaders to treat tension as a problem, something to fix quickly and make the feeling go away. But this tension is different. This tension is not asking us to become someone else. It's asking us to examine what attached itself to who we already are. That's fundamentally a different invitation. I want to go somewhere honest, because this distillation process can hurt. The assumption is usually that the things we need to examine are broken things, obvious problems, easy to identify and let go. But that's not always true. Some of the things attached to our identity are genuinely beautiful things. Some helped us survive seasons we couldn't have made it through otherwise. Some built relationships that still matter deeply. Some created the very strengths that made us effective, that allowed us to serve people well and lead with real impact. Some of them are things that people love about us, things woven into our closest connections, shared rituals, ways of relating that create belonging. And that's exactly why questioning them feels threatening. It doesn't feel like examining something broken. It feels like questioning something that worked, something that connected, something that mattered to people we love. Sometimes we become more loyal to the story that protected us than to the truth that could free us. And the resistance to examining that story, that's not weakness. That's a completely natural response to being asked to look honestly at something that once carried you. And I want to name one more thing here because I think it belongs in this conversation. Sometimes leaders adopt language like servant leader, kingdom-minded, purpose-driven. And I want to be careful how I say this because I think the aspiration behind those labels is often genuine. But there's a difference between a label that describes where you're headed and an identity that's been distilled into who you actually are. Some of those labels get placed on top of accumulated identity before the real examination has happened underneath them. Not as a deception, as aspiration. And aspiration is a good thing. It's just not the same thing as identity. The biblical language for this process, and I think it belongs here, is pruning and refinement and stewardship. Not destruction, not walking away from everything you built. This conversation is not asking you to quit, start over, or burn anything down. But it is asking you to examine what's truly at the center. Because a season that's coming, and it always comes, will require a version of you that's more aligned with who you were actually created to be. The distillation process prepares you for it. What I said earlier about the heads, the tails, the spent grain, and the barrels that go on to shape other things, I think that matters deeply right here. Some of what may need to loosen is grip. Some of what the process might eventually separate out, it was never meaningless. It served a season. It created connection. It built something real. It's carried us through years that required exactly that version of us. The goal is not to look back on those things with regret. The goal is to ask honestly, was this ever supposed to carry the full weight of identity? Or did it attach itself during a season when it was needed and stayed past the season without anyone really noticing? Something can matter deeply and still not be who you are at the center. Something could have shaped you genuinely and still not be what remains when everything else begins to fall away. Distillation is not questioning whether something existed. It's questioning whether it was ever supposed to define the pour. And the process, when you stay in it honestly, is actually beautiful. Because what comes through the other side is a more aligned version of who you were created to be. The beauty is in the alignment, and it requires attention, patience, honesty, intentionality. It doesn't happen automatically. Not in a single conversation, not in a single listen. It happens over time and with care, with the kind of slow, deliberate reflection that most of us don't build into our lives unless we decide to. If you've ever gone to a whiskey tasting, you know it's not a rush. You sit with it. You notice what surfaces, and you come back to it. That's what I want to leave you with today. 3 things to carry from this conversation. First, attachment is human. It's not failure. The things that attach themselves to your identity over the years weren't mistakes. They were adaptations. Survival, the natural result of a life lived under real pressure, real responsibility, and real relationships that needed something specific from you. Removing shame from this conversation is the first move of distillation. Second, tension is information. If you've been feeling the gap between what you built and what you're built for, that feeling is not weakness. It may be the most honest signal you've received in years. The tension isn't asking you to become someone else. It's asking you to look more carefully at who you already are underneath everything that's attached itself along the way. And third, nothing in the distillation process is wasted. The things that eventually loosen their grip, the things that shift from the center of your identity to a different place in your story, they don't disappear. They nourish something else. Your story doesn't lose its chapters. It just gets clearer about which one you're actually in. Let me come back to where we started. How would you define identity? If your answer came fast, I get it. Most of ours do. We've been carrying those answers for a long time. The roles we stepped into, the ways we survived, the strengths the world kept rewarding. the versions of ourselves that worked, for seasons that required exactly that version. Distillation doesn't ask you to reject any of it. It asks you to be honest about what was always you and what came along for the run. That's a slower question and a harder one. And it doesn't give you a plan, but it does give you a process. The only invitation I want to leave you with today is to begin. Notice the tension. Write it down somewhere, not to fix it, just to name it. Because naming it is the first step. And the first step is the whole difference between carrying something indefinitely and beginning to examine it honestly. You may not have heard about the still yet, but it's something that I've built that I haven't talked much about on the podcast. It's a secure space to write, to capture the tension that you're feeling and the questions that keep surfacing, the things you haven't quite found the right words for yet. And what makes this different is that as you write, as you track those thoughts and patterns over time, it connects what you're carrying to crafted clarity conversations that speak directly to it. We have nearly 40 crafted clarity conversations now, and it's searchable by tension, by season, by what actually is present for you. It's not about finding episodes. It's about staying in the process long enough for something to surface. If that sounds like a place you need, it's at craftedclarity.net. And if you already have a place to distill the tension that you're carrying that already works for you, use it. What matters is that you start paying attention to it. Because the tension is not a problem. It's the invitation. And remember, clarity isn't found. It's crafted. Thanks for listening to Crafted Clarity. If you're a leader wrestling with the tension between success and significance, or if you're trying to align your work with a deeper calling, I'd love to connect with you. If your organization is facing questions about strategy, whether it's alignment, ROI, or building confidence in your team, this is the work we do every day at iBrand. And if you walk this journey yourself, or maybe you're right in the middle of it, I'd love to hear your story and maybe even share it here on the podcast. You can find me at craftedclarity.net.